The following story is purely fictional. Any resemblance to actual people, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. This story addresses sensitive and potentially distressing topics, including traumatic events, which may evoke strong emotions or trigger difficult feelings in some individuals. Viewer and listener discretion is strongly advised.
The day had started like any other. Dani stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes and making coffee while the morning sun filtered through the windows. Katie Bear, as Dani affectionately called her daughter, came bouncing down the stairs, her face bright with excitement.
Mama, guess what we're doing today?
Katie said, barely able to contain her excitement as she slid into her seat at the table. Dani handed Katie a plate of bacon and eggs.
What's that, sweetie?
We're building bird houses. I'm going to make one for Miss Blue Jay outside. Her roof's been leaking, and I think that's why she's been so cranky.
Katie giggled, referring to the bird that often perched outside her window. Dani laughed softly. Katie had such a vivid imagination, always turning simple things into stories.
Well, make sure it's a nice big house so Miss Blue Jay has room to stretch her wings.
David, Dani's husband, was rushing around, grabbing his keys and briefcase. He looked distracted like he often did these days. Katie turned to him with a playful grin.
Daddy, tickle the bear,
She said, referring to their little game where David would chase her around the house while she pretended to be a bear.
Not today, Katie Bear.
David said with a sigh, not even looking up.
I'm running late. Maybe tonight, okay?
Katie pouted, but it didn't last long. She always bounced back quickly.
Promise?
Promise.
David replied, though his eyes were on his phone, and Dani wasn't sure if he even registered the conversation. As David hurried out the door, Dani checked the clock. The bus was outside, and in her rush to get Katie ready, they lost track of time.
Katie, grab your things. The bus is here.
Katie scrambled to collect her school supplies, but in her hurry, her bag tipped over, spilling everything onto the floor. Pencils, crayons, and notebooks scattered everywhere.
Wait!
Dani shouted, waving her arms. But the bus driver didn't stop, the yellow vehicle slowly disappearing down the road. Katie looked up at her mom with big, disappointed eyes.
Now what?
Dani clenched her jaw, frustration rising.
We'll follow the bus, but they better let you on.
They jumped into the car, speeding down the road to catch up. But when they finally caught the bus at a stop, the driver waved them off.
Only at a stop.
The bus driver frowned and shook her head, pointing to the street behind them.
You know the rules.
Dani sighed heavily.
Great. Now we are even later. Get back in the car. I guess I'm taking you to school.
When they arrived at the school, Mr. George, the kind older man who worked there, saw them and jogged over to help. He opened the door for Katie, giving her a warm smile.
Tickle the bear,
He teased, playing along with Katie's favorite game. She laughed, hugging him quickly before running off toward her class.
Mr. George, I got you a headband.
She stopped short and opened her backpack, grabbing a blue headband from her bag. Dani recognized it as one of her old ones. Mr. George smiled.
I will wear it all day. Now get to class before Mrs. Sandy comes and yells at me.
Dani watched her go, feeling a small sense of relief that, despite the hectic morning, Katie had made it to school with a smile on her face. Mr. George smiled at her.
Have a good day, Miss Dani.
You too, Mr. George.
She said, returning the smile before driving off. Not 10 minutes later, as Dani made her way to work, she noticed police cars speeding down the highway. She sighed, thinking it must be an accident.
It's going to be a busy day in the ER. Hope everyone else shows up today.
She muttered, pulling into the hospital parking lot. She hurried inside. The ER was already quite busy. She walked down the hallway toward the staff room and went inside. The staff room was empty and eerily quiet. Dani had just put her things in her locker when her phone rang. It was odd. No one ever called her at work this early. She looked at the caller ID. Amy. This was strange considering they had just had a fight last night. Dani hesitated for a moment, knowing she needed to lock her phone away, but something told her to answer it. She pressed the phone to her ear.
Amy, hey, I can't talk right now.
Dani, are you at work yet? Did the school call you yet?
Yes, I just got here. The school? No, why? What's wrong?
There is a gunman at Katie's school. The school is in lockdown, but Dani, he got inside. He is in the school.
Dani didn't even hear the rest of what Amy said. She dropped the phone into her bag and ran. Her thoughts spiraled as she tore out of the hospital and back to her car. The drive to the school felt like a blur, her mind racing with a million what-ifs. There are over 500 kids at Glassbrook Elementary. It can't be Katie. What are the odds? 10%? No, less than that. Dani tried to rationalize the numbers in her head, trying to calm herself. There hasn't been a shooting, it's just a man with a gun. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Yes, that's got to be it. But none of the numbers made sense. She couldn't focus on anything except getting to Katie. When Dani arrived at the school, chaos was already unfolding. Parents stood in a growing crowd outside the building, held back by police officers who were trying to maintain order. A larger woman was screaming at the police, demanding to be let inside, her voice hysterical.
Let me through, damn you! My baby's in there!
She shrieked, trying to push past the officers, who held her back firmly. The woman suddenly charged towards the school, using her mass to push past the officers. The officers had no choice but to bring her to the ground. The woman screamed and began fighting the officers while screaming about police brutality. Dani barely registered the scene. Her body moved on instinct, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find Katie. She had to know if her daughter was safe. As she moved toward the crowd, suddenly gunshots rang out, loud and sharp, breaking through the chaos. Dani froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then came more shots, a lower sound this time, followed by a rapid burst of higher-pitched gunfire. The sound echoed in her ears, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Everything around her seemed to spin. Two men nearby had gotten into a fist fight, yelling about gun laws. Dani barely noticed as police broke them apart. She was focused only on the school. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Chaos was everywhere. People were in hysterics. The police were trying their best to calm people down, but they were obviously strained. The minutes seemed like hours. Then suddenly, over the police radio, she heard the words she had been dreading.
We have him. He surrendered, but we need medical help. We have injured. Children have been shot. We need EMS now.
Dani's phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled for it, her hands shaking as she saw the caller ID. It was her boss. She answered without thinking.
Donna, get the trauma team ready. I gotta go.
She shouted into the phone. The police were shouting for medical assistance, and Dani didn't hesitate. Her daughter was inside, but she had to help. Two state police officers were standing by their cars about 20 feet from where Dani was standing. She overheard one say that EMS is at least 5 minutes away. They sounded very concerned and aggravated that EMS wasn't already on scene.
I'm a nurse.
She yelled as she ran towards them. She showed them her nurse's badge that was still hanging from her neck. One of them hesitated, looking at her with concern.
Are you sure you can handle this? Ma'am, it's not going to be pretty in there. EMTs are on their way.
I can help. We are a small town. EMS consists of 3 people. It'll be another 15 minutes before help arrives from the next town. You guys need help now. I work at the ER. I can do this. Let me go, please.
This was life or death, and she wasn't about to stand by. One of the officers nodded and told her to stay close to him, and they sprinted towards the school.
Here, over here, we need help now,
came a voice from the left. Dani turned and saw a local officer she recognized as Fred Davidson. He had a child in his arms. The child wasn't moving and was covered in blood. Dani raced to him. However, she quickly realized the child was already gone.
Take me to the others. I'm sorry, but we can't help this one.
Dani tried to remain professional. Fred nodded as he gently laid down the child. Dani's head was spinning. All she could think of was Katie, but she knew she had to be strong for what was to come. Fred looked at her, tears in his eyes.
Let's go, but be warned, it's bad. Very bad. I've never seen anything like it. Children, blood everywhere. I swear, that one was alive when I picked her up. There is just so many wounded.
Dani nodded. Fred grabbed her hand. They entered the school through the side door. The glass had been shot out. Broken glass was everywhere. The first thing she saw was Mr. George. He was lying on the floor, half leaning against the wall. His face was gone. Parts of his jaw were missing. She only knew it was him because she had seen him earlier that day and noticed his hairband, the one Katie had given him, her old headband. A mop bucket was across the hall. The mop laid next to him in a pool of blood. Mr. George must have been mopping the floor when the shooter entered. She shook her head, trying to fight off the urge to cry.
Ma'am, are you okay?
Fred laid his hand gently on her shoulder.
Yes, it's just that I knew him. He's the janitor. I just saw him today. My daughter gave him that headband this morning.
Suddenly her phone rang. She recognized the ringtone right away. It was David. Damn it, she thought to herself. She had forgotten to call him. She answered the phone.
David, I'm sorry.
Dani, where are you? I'm at the school. Your sister called me. The police, they say shots have been fired. Where are you?
I'm inside the school.
Inside the school. What? What are you doing in the
David,
school?
I'm
It's
fine.
not safe.
They have the guy, but there is wounded. Mr. George is dead. I'm sorry, but I gotta go. I'll be out as soon as EMS gets here.
She hung up the phone. She knew every second mattered. She looked at Fred. He opened his mouth to say something but simply looked away. She pushed herself to continue. Dani's mind raced as she moved from one room to the next, her training kicking in as she triaged the wounded. Children lay scattered across classrooms, some beyond help, others hanging on by a thread. It was excruciating for her to have to simply walk past the bodies, knowing that some still gripped to life but due to their wounds would bleed out quickly without immediate surgery. These were not the occasional handgun wounds she occasionally dealt with at the hospital. These wounds were worse than even hunting accidents. The rounds that caused these wounds were very powerful. She knelt by a boy with a bad but treatable leg wound.
We need something to stop the bleeding. Cloth of some sort, or a belt. We could make a tourniquet. Now! Get me something. Anything.
She barked, not realizing how cold the statement was. Fred, the officer who had been helping her, noticed some T-shirts from what appeared to be an art project drying on a clothing rack. A pile of clean shirts lay next to the rack on a small stand.
Thanks, Davidson. These should work.
Dani muttered, trying to keep her hands steady as she worked. It wasn't easy. She was used to working in an emergency room, with proper equipment. She didn't even have a needle and thread. Fred noticed her frustration.
Call me Fred,
he said softly as he handed her some T-shirts. He tore a few in half as they worked side by side, trying to remain focused. He silently gave thanks that the child was unconscious, most likely passed out from the pain of his wounds and utter trauma of the experience. Together, they managed to stop the bleeding. Fred called for more help, and 2 officers ran in and carried the boy out. Dani's heart pounded as she scanned the room for more wounded, only to find nothing but lifeless bodies. She stood up and moved out the door towards the next room, each step more frantic than the last. Then she saw him, the shooter. He was being led down the hallway, his hands zip-tied behind his back. He couldn't have been more than 20, his face expressionless as he glanced around, seemingly indifferent to the destruction he had caused. For a brief moment, Dani locked eyes with him, and it felt like ice ran through her veins. He didn't say a word as the police led him past her, but there was something in his gaze, a cold, detached look that made her stomach turn. It was as if he was admiring his work. She turned away quickly, bile rising in her throat. She entered the next room and her world shattered. She saw Katie. Dani froze, her breath catching in her chest. Katie lay crumpled against the wall, her small body twisted, blood smeared across her skin, her blue dress covered in blood. She was alive. For a split second, Dani thought she saw her daughter mouth the word "mommy." Her eyes opened wide, but then they suddenly rolled back, her body jerking in a violent seizure.
No, Katie, Mommy's here! Mommy's here!
Dani screamed, rushing to her daughter's side. Her hands trembled as she touched her daughter's face. Her skin felt cold. Katie went stiff and convulsed again.
Stay with me, baby. Please, don't leave me. Katie Bear, please.
She tried to remain calm, but it was all but impossible. Just as she was about to do something, anything, the EMTs rushed into the room. Fred said something to the first EMT, but Dani wasn't paying attention. They hesitated for a moment, realizing the horror before them, before one of them stepped forward.
Ma'am, we need to take her. We'll do everything we can.
The room began to spin. Dani was already on her knees with Katie in her arms, but she felt everything slip away. Fred quickly caught her as she slumped to the floor. The EMTs worked quickly, lifting Katie onto a stretcher and starting CPR. Dani tried to rise to her feet, trying to push Fred away. Fred was able, however, to help Dani stand. Staggering, Dani followed them as far as she could, her legs weak, her heart shattered, until the stretcher disappeared down the hall. The next month passed in a fog. Dani basically lived at the hospital. Seconds became hours, and hours passed into days. Dani sat by Katie's bedside. She felt empty and cold as she held her daughter's small, lifeless hand. The machines kept Katie's body alive, but the doctors had already told her the truth. Katie would never wake up. Severe brain damage. There was simply no hope. David had barely been at the hospital. He had retreated into alcohol, refusing to face the reality of their daughter's condition. They had fought constantly over the past month, and each fight seemed to pull them further apart. David wanted to hold on forever, alcohol fueling his hope. He had changed. The last time he had visited, he was too drunk to stand up. It was then that Dani knew the truth. It was up to her, and only her, to make the decision no parent should ever have to make. How long to leave their child on life support. When to let go. On the third day, after signing what felt like an endless amount of paperwork, the machines were turned off, and Dani held Katie's hand as the warmth slowly faded away. She pressed her forehead against her daughter's, sobbing uncontrollably. Knowing this was goodbye, she whispered her final goodbye into Katie's ear as the machine's flatline alarm faintly went off. Dani fell to her knees, sobbing. She felt like her life was over. Little did she know, it would get worse. Much, much worse.